For everyone with an interest in MASH, or more broadly, steatotic liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 6, Episode 3, continuing our new V2.0 episode design and looking at a new product from HistoIndex and likely policy impact of changes at the FDA and other first quarter events, starts now.
For the last 5 years, MASLD stakeholders, whether manufacturers, trial sites, providers, payers, patients, or investors, have turned to surfing the MASH Tsunami to keep track of drug and device development, epidemiology, public health initiatives, and practice patterns. This weekend, we are sharing the 3 main sections from our Episode 3. Our Roundtable section looks at the epidemiology of MET-ALD as compared to ALD and MASLD. Our Newsmaker discussion with Yukti Chowdhury of HistoIndex focuses on the launch of FibroSIGHT, the company's first second harmonic generation-based tool for clinical patient management. And our expert interview is with Jeff McIntyre, Vice President, Liver Programs at the Global Liver Institute, and a patient advocate with extensive policy and government experience.
This week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
FibroSIGHT is a tool that is based on this SSG imaging platform that can enable clinicians, specifically pathologists, to make more consistent fibrosis assessments through the visual clarity for collagen that is afforded by this completely stain-free imaging technology. When pathologists are presented with second harmonic generation images or SSG images and quantitative readouts, in addition to the standard stained images that they routinely work with for fibrosis staging, their concordance with each other was significantly higher for the fibrosis, particularly for lower stages, F1 to F2. It really goes back to the basic question, or the value proposition is, where biopsies must be taken, are we extracting the most value from these biopsies to then make the most informed decision?
If you happen to live in a disease category like, say, fatty liver, MASLD, MASH, what's the best you can hope for?
There's a delay there in terms of being able to get the appropriate coding for things like fibrosis, which GLI has put in for. That's going to be analogous to everywhere else. Will drug approvals go through at the same rate? Nobody knows. Will accelerated approval still be a thing? Nobody knows.
Are we looking into a landscape where we will have, and I think that would be beautiful, in a number of years, several drugs on the shelf, just like we have for hypertension today or diabetes, and then you say, okay, we start with whatever cheapest, most effective, whatever is reimbursed, and then you sort of build up in a system and then treat to target. That would be a dream scenario.
This week's sponsors for Surfing the MASH Tsunami include
Madrigal Pharmaceuticals, Inc. is a biopharmaceutical company focused on delivering novel therapeutics for metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis, or MASH, a liver disease with high unmet medical need. Madrigal's medication, Rezdiffra, resmetirom, is a once-daily oral liver-directed THR beta agonist designed to target key underlying causes of MASH. Rezdiffra is the first and only medication approved by the FDA for the treatment of MASH with moderate to advanced fibrosis, consistent with stages F2 to F3. An ongoing Phase 3 outcomes trial is evaluating Rezdiffra for the treatment of compensated MASH cirrhosis, consistent with stage F4C. For more information, visit www.madrigalpharma.com.
LiverRight and the LiverRight Scanning Network. On April 15th, 2025, LiverRight will open America's first virtual specialty clinic for liver disease, offering adults in all 50 states video appointments and helping GI practices and health systems triage and treat the swelling numbers of patients seeking MASLD and MASH testing. LiverRight offers same-week video visits and accepts insurance. For more information, contact LiverRight, that's liver, and then RIGHT at www.liverright.com.
Tawazin Health, your partner in global liver health innovation. At Tawazin Health, we specialize in providing small or large-scale access to FibroScan examinations for liver health-focused early detection, clinical trials, independent research, and collaborative projects with clinicians and FibroScan providers increasingly throughout the world. As industry-leading experts, we design and deliver high-quality FibroScan services because we know that accurate, high-quality, reliable data drives better outcomes. To learn about our sister lifestyle app, mylife365.me, click the Tawazin Health link on the Surfing MASH homepage.
Hi there, and welcome to Episode 3. As I record this introduction, it's April Fool's Day, April 1st, but not exactly April Fool's Day in the traditional sense, because when we woke up this morning and read about all the high-level officials at FDA being either reassigned to jobs in places like the Indian health system or simply let go, that was no joke, nor was Robert Califf's comment that the FDA as we know it is probably over, although we don't know what's going to replace it yet. So We'll be talking about that with Jeff McIntyre, our expert interview today, who's a combination patient advocate and policy guy. Our newsmaker interview is with Yukti Chowdhury of HistoIndex. We'll be talking about FibroSIGHT, a new product they are introducing, which will make it more advantageous for physicians to use the results of biopsy when analyzing patients whose biopsy reads are equivocal. Now, that raises, as you'll hear in the interview, an interesting question about do we really want more biopsy reads, because do we really want more biopsy? But clearly, this is an important product, and it has some significant implications for how patients are diagnosed and treated. And then finally, we have our portion of the Emerging Trends Conference to look at. It's a fascinating episode. I'm really excited about it, and we will start now with the roundtable discussion. So here we go.
First, our roundtable discussion, part 3. Louise and Roger are joined by Professor Alexander Krog from the University of Southern Denmark, who is the current Secretary General of the European Association for the Study of the Liver, Dr. Alexander Leilos from Robert Wood Johnson Hospital, and Jen Lee Jones, founder of the Sober Livers Patient Support Group. This discussion focuses on a range of issues: promising drug classes in development today, the role of bariatric surgery both as therapeutic option and source for learning, and some issues around ALD and cirrhosis measurement in clinical trials.
So I want to just shift to two things. I missed Saturday. Okay, but Saturday and second half of Friday were mostly about effective therapies, if I recall correctly, from the agenda. Who would like to comment a little bit on what they heard in that meeting that they found that element that they found interesting or exciting or novel?
No, I can do that. Yeah, I think there was a lot of very important takeaways. One talk, there were several great talks, actually, all of them, but it was interesting, the surgeon talking about bariatric surgery. And I think we've been very successful with GLP-1s, and we all come to like them because they solve a lot of things at the same time. But the math he did, at least in a US-based system, was that this is not a bad treatment. And what scared many of us in the past was some of these things where we end up with short bowel syndrome and all kinds of issues. But it's not so bad anymore. And actually also this is more or less in the right patient, the one-for-all solution. And economically, it's actually compared to the long-term, at least with the current cost of GLP-1 based or incretin-based therapy, is not a bad thing. So that, I think, was also an important takeaway, that we should not just stare blind on these amazing drugs, because there might be patients where this is a very good option. Still GLP-1s are effective. For many patients, they do have side effects. Even we titrate very carefully. They do have change in whatever the perception of food or whatever, and so they don't want it. And that's where we should definitely, I think, be aware that this is still an option. I think that was definitely a great talk. And then there was the talks you already mentioned a little bit, the inspiration there from Ray and the others, how to do it actually, how to implement it in clinical practice. Now we're not in a US-based system, but I think again was inspiring to see how do you go home and make a business model so you can actually, how can you actually do this? And also I think I was inspired to see that, okay, we have these breakthroughs now in these trials, but what about combination? What would the future look like? Marinella did a great talk there. See, okay, these different drugs do different things. Now we are a little bit of a single drug level, but what are we looking into in the future? And it's extension of our genetic discussion, but FGF21s, GLP-1s, GIPs, glucagon agonists, various different things. And that's again, are we looking into a landscape where we will have, and I think that would be beautiful, in a number of years, several drugs on the shelf, just like we have for hypertension today or diabetes. And then you say, okay, we start with whatever cheapest, most effective, whatever is reimbursed, and then you sort of build up in a system and then treat to target. And I think that would be a dream scenario. And then opening also to see, now there are 2 phase 2 trials going for alcohol-related liver disease, which is important. And the first was really important discussion there was, should we make clinical trials on med-ALD alone or not? And most likely not, because of the arguments I put forward earlier. It simply does not make sense from a drug development perspective because patients are moved. So either you lump them together with ALD trials, what's happening now. So you basically take patients who drink moderate to higher, or you try to expand from the MASH trials into the med-ALD space. And the great thing for this clinicians or patient is that if you have a drug that covers the full spectrum, it will be much easier to implement and use for us, and not suddenly like that then you have a pet, something popping up, and then you cannot reimburse them anymore because they don't fit it. So that would be, I think, was a good discussion, and I hope there was a lot of companies in the room also who heard this discussion and will take it with them.
When you get down down to the drugs, as Alexander mentioned a little bit, the FGF21 to me is very interesting just because we don't really have at this point. I get a lot of referrals for people who have basically cirrhosis, maybe not decompensated, not portal hypertension, but who have metabolic steatotic liver disease, and resmetirom and the GLPs probably not having been studied or not have published data on it. But that effect on the F4 patients I thought was very, very interesting. And that's really these people who have a little bit higher KPA values exceeding 20, where you're not going to use resmetirom, giving an opportunity potentially there. I guess that's maybe 2 years away, a year and a half away, 2 years away. I was very excited about that. I think that's good news.
I have a question. Truth be told, I didn't go Saturday morning. I slept in a little bit, but I did come in the afternoon where we had some really good discussions about clinical trials and MASLD. And one thing that I didn't bring up during the conference, but has been on my mind, we keep on talking about, okay, people's drinking levels go up and down and up and down. How are we going to put them in a clinical trial? How are we going to study them? What about the people like me, for example, who have been sober for a year plus? Why aren't we looking at maybe this group of people who may have cardiometabolic factors, are also have a high BMI, but they have been sober for 1 year plus, so you actually have a baseline there that doesn't change, so you don't have that variable, and look there first, and then extend the trials to other people that may be drinking. That, to me, would be a safer way of going about doing a clinical trial to start with. Just to come up with something that may work.
No, that was also part of the discussion. If the drug developers dare to do that, basically they could do an extra arm or add whatever 100 or 200 extra patients like you. But of course, the risk, when you are lean and you don't drink anymore, your risk of progression is low. And what you're looking for in clinical trial is endpoints. It's not good for the patients, but it's the only way to prove a drug actually works, that there are more endpoints in the placebo arm than in the intervention arm. So that's, again, a little bit the barrier. And that's back to where we need some kind of consensus sooner or later. How do we control for alcohol historically, and how does that fit into the different subcategories, and how do we monitor it going forward in clinical trials of both pure MASH, MASLD, and MASLD, ALD, and how do we, and that's again something where the agency, FDA or EMA, are not really clear yet, because we haven't seen any trials. So there's no clear guidance on what should a trial in this spectrum look like. What we all want to get away from is the nightmare we've had in the MASH field, and that's the biopsies and the balloon cells that sort of messed it all up more or less and has not helped us. So everybody wants to go to a position where we can do it a non-invasive test. This is how it's going to be driven in clinical practice anyway. But of course, it needs to be this engagement with the drug developer, that we help educate them. We help to bring the research base that actually sell that it's actually a good and safe and probably much better idea, and easier to conduct the trials.
Can I ask a second question on that? Just kind of a challenge on you to that is, with the endpoints, couldn't you look at the reduction in fibrosis, for example, if somebody has cirrhosis? Could that be an endpoint? Could an endpoint be a reduction in steatosis for somebody with MASLD? Could an endpoint be helping a cardio risk factor? It doesn't necessarily, an endpoint doesn't have to necessarily be stopping drinking or reducing drinking, because this person already has. But, I have a lot of people in my community, I just have to say, that are abstinent and they didn't get access to a liver transplant because their MELD score went down. And however, they're looking for a treatment. They're looking for a treatment for their cirrhosis, because having compensated cirrhosis does not give you warm fuzzies. It still doesn't make you feel good every day. You're still going in for scans. There's a lot of things that you do, and you're not going to get a transplant unless you get sicker. So I get asked by my community, so what's out there for me? And so that's my challenge point.
Yeah, no, it's been discussed, and actually we're working with AASLD and AASLD together actually on defining these endpoints to have a consensus in the liver community, because nobody knows. I could talk a long while, but basically you separate between phase 2 and phase 3 trial. Phase 3 trial has to be clinical endpoint, otherwise you're not approved, since we don't have these high-level surrogate endpoints. And then you can see would you separate ALD from non-ALD? Would you go for non-invasive or invasive? But basically, you need to have something an endpoint that is reasonably likely to or have a clinical endpoint. And you're right, reversing from cirrhosis to whatever F3 or something, or a decrease in non-invasive tests like transient elastography, ELF test, would convince me. But I'm not the problem here. The problem is the regulators. And afterwards, the reimbursement system. Do they actually buy that this is a good one? And that's the problem. We cannot develop strong surrogate markers if we don't have effective drugs. Because that's the only way you can see, okay, if this patient improved with less endpoints, okay, markers also drop. Okay, then it's convincing. But if that's not proven, it's impossible to have this high level of surrogate endpoints.
With that in mind, one of the questions I heard a few times floating around on Thursday and Friday was whether you actually should be doing drug trials in MASLD or not.
So again, I'm passionate about this, so you should, but you should not do it in isolation. My key point away, the last thing I said at the meeting was, my key takeaway is that while MASLD is operational, it makes sense from a conceptual perspective. In a clinical trial setting, it cannot be seen in isolation, just like in clinical practice. So it sort of bridges alcohol as a lead driver versus metabolic as a lead driver, but you cannot see it in isolation for the reason I put forward. And also mean that trials, in my view, would be a mistake to try to do trials just doing MASLD and not capturing. Because also just the 20 or 30 grams that is allowed in MASLD and MASH is harmful drinking, that's for sure. These people, if you have a BMI of plus 30, you drink 3 units a day, a guy like me, that has a huge impact. And if you stop drinking, it will have a huge impact. So it's again, we need categories to act. That's the way human brain works. Biology and our life is working more as a continuous variable. And that's why it should not be, in my view, it would be a mistake to try to force this into a specific category for clinical trials or for that sake, clinical management.
That's where I was by the time I left on Friday. That if we can't agree on a definition of MASLD, it's kind of hard to do a clinical trial on MASLD.
In today's Newsmaker segment, HistoIndex Director of Clinical Development Yukti Chowdhury joins Roger to discuss FibroSIGHT, HistoIndex's first service designed to bring the unique insights of second harmonic generation convergence to clinical practice. We discuss the product, which is unique and a breakthrough, as well as some of the downstream issues that might emerge because FibroSIGHT requires biopsies, and perhaps repeat biopsies, to be used.
This week, our Newsmaker interviews with Yukti Chowdhury of HistoIndex, where she serves as Director of Clinical Development. Yukti, how are you this morning?
I'm good. Hi, how are you, Roger? Thanks for having me here today.
Welcome. And Yukti is in Singapore, so we're doing this kind of early in the morning our time and kind of late in the day her time. We're all awake, we're all refreshed, and we're all excited to do this interview. In large part because Yukti, as Director of Clinical Development, is the lead on a product called FibroSIGHT, which HistoIndex brought to market, I guess formally last week, right?
Yeah, 17th of March.
Like 2 weeks ago. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's an important and exciting product. It's a little different than anything that anybody has offered so far. And I wanted to take some time for you folks to listen, understand what it is, and then to ask Yukti some practical questions about how it works in the U.S. environment. So, Yukti, do me a favor, just to get started. We'd like to be sure that everyone who listens knows a little bit about the folks they're talking with. So if you could take just 2 or 3 minutes and tell people a little bit about your experience and how you came to be at HistoIndex and in this role, that would be a great place to start.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Actually, it's great to make an appearance here on your podcast. Heard a lot about it. And so I'm Yukti, the Director of Clinical Development at HistoIndex. And what does clinical development at a technology company like HistoIndex look like? First, I assume that the audience is at least somewhat familiar with HistoIndex's second harmonic generation SHG, Biopsy Imaging Technology. So in the context of that technology, my job is to evaluate unmet clinical needs in the healthcare system and then to develop and deploy novel, commercially viable applications of this technology into clinical practice. So we have the development and clinical practice, so hence clinical development at HistoIndex. Anyway, I don a few hats at HistoIndex, including sustained applications of the technology in clinical trials, but the focus of my role is really to bring our technology to a routine patient care market, starting with the United States. Prior to HistoIndex, I had co-founded a molecular diagnostics company, which focused on oncology, and I was the chief technology officer there for 5.5 years. I oversaw the design, development, and clinical deployment of several molecular diagnostic assays for cancers, and these are provided as a service out of certified and accredited labs, specifically CLIA and CAP, so both in the US as well as Singapore. These assays were all laboratory developed tests, or LDTs, which the audience may or may not know about, but my professional experience so far has been a journey of developing tests, creating and maintaining the quality standards for the test, and ultimately delivering a high-quality clinical service. This experience shaped my role at HistoIndex. So to take what it has to offer technologically, which is immense, and then to mold it into a clinical diagnostic service with all the attendant requirements, including operational matters, personnel and laboratory qualifications, validation of the test logistics, and importantly, commercial matters. How are we going to get paid for this, providing this service? So, the multi-layered and honestly quite complex healthcare system in the US, provides many opportunities, but also requires deft navigation. So that is something that I am endeavoring on with my team, and this team is overseeing this multiple facets of this, the US healthcare system.
And we're going to come back to all that in a minute, because obviously the deft navigation, as you put it, of the reimbursement system is the most interesting challenge for a product like this, I think. But before we do that, one more thing about you. Can you tell our audience one thing about you that they might not know, or is a little atypical or different, that if you didn't tell them?
Okay, well, it may not be unusual, but it may be interesting to the audience that I'm actually a molecular biologist by training, and I have a PhD in that field. I'm a lab-trained professional, so I loved my time in the laboratory, designing new assays and challenging the limits of detection of gene mutations. That's what I did. And in my career, I have seen and professionally delivered some of the latest advances in molecular technology for actual patients' care with actionable impact on patient management. So what it brings me to is what motivates me is to bring the latest innovations to practical and cost-effective patient care, whether in molecular diagnostics or tissue-based digital pathology, such as HistoIndex's technology.
Is there any one thing that you do for fun or interest that doesn't involve work per se?
Lots of things. Yeah, I play tennis. I like to hike, trek. I am a Hispanophile, so I love to learn and speak Spanish whenever I can.
That's great. So with that, why don't we shift to FibroSIGHT? Can you take a couple of minutes and tell our audience what FibroSIGHT is beyond the simple description that you gave so far about SHG?
Yeah. So FibroSIGHT is actually the first step that HistoIndex has taken in the direction of clinical diagnostics. It is a clinical test or assay for the accurate and consistent assessment of fibrosis in MASH liver biopsies. So SHG has exquisite sensitivity for detection of fibrillar collagen, and FibroSIGHT is a tool that is based on this SHG imaging platform that can enable clinicians, specifically pathologists, to make more consistent fibrosis assessments through the visual clarity for collagen that is afforded by this completely stain-free imaging technology. So in the current climate, with the approval of resmetirom for MASH treatment, patients with moderate to advanced fibrosis who are candidates for treatment with the resmetirom, accurate fibrosis assessment becomes even more crucial to determine the best candidate for the best treatment. So FibroSIGHT, the test, has been built on evidence from studies showing that when pathologists are presented with second harmonic generation images or SHG images and quantitative readouts, in addition to the standard stained images that they routinely work with for fibrosis staging, their concordance with each other was significantly higher for the fibrosis, particularly for lower stages, F1 to F2. Hence, they were more consistent for fibrosis assessment, which in the clinical practice would translate to more consistent and more confident treatment selection being made. So when do we use a FibroSIGHT? Whenever liver biopsies are recommended, and that is in the case of discordant non-invasive assessments, example, a high VCTE but a low ELF, where the clinical picture for the extent of fibrosis is not clear. So FibroSIGHT-based assessment of fibrosis, either in conjunction with the standard Masson trichrome staining or independently, can enable an accurate fibrosis assessment. And from the literature and hepatologist clinician surveys, we estimate about 10% of MASH patients have discordant non-invasive test results and are candidates for biopsies. So where needed for a biopsy, we offer the clinical service of enhanced fibrosis assessment going beyond standard staining. It really goes back to the basic question, or the value proposition is, where biopsies must be taken, are we extracting the most value from these biopsies to then make the most informed decision? So that's what FibroSIGHT is about.
Putting that in a little bit of context for our audience, you may recall we've had Dean Tang, who's chief technologist at HistoIndex on several occasions, talking about the technology and uses of it. And there were sessions last year, and I'll get the session numbers as note for this interview, where Jeff McIntyre and I talked about the visualization that this kind of technology and others like it afford as a massive step forward in terms of understanding what's going on in the liver and what to do. So technology is extraordinary, okay? And as you know, I'm a big fan. What I'm intrigued by, though, is that 10% of all MASH patients in the U.S.
would have non-concordant NITs assessments.
Eligible for or
a biopsy.
Biopsies is a suggested step. Right. How many of those patients are getting biopsies today?
So from our conversations with hepatologists and people who are seeing at-risk MASH patients, it is this percentage that 5 to 10% is what is talked about in terms of those that they cannot resolve by a serial NIT assessment. So a biopsy becomes necessary to resolve the case of what is the fibrosis degree for this particular patient. So it's that proportion that we're talking about.
Do you have a number for how many biopsies are done in that kind of situation in the U.S. right now, annually? So 5 to 10% of X, right?
Yeah. So it's the numbers of biopsies taken in 2023, which we have numbers for, is estimated to be about 163,000. This is based on a survey, market research that was done. But moving forward and looking into the future in 2028, because of the increasing prevalence of MASH in the population, plus increased awareness of the disease, plus better diagnostic methods, there will be up to 1 million biopsies have been forecasted to be taken for this particular scenario, where the results is a discordant NIT assessment and a biopsy needs to be taken. So this is following the trajectory of increasing prevalence of NASH in the population with increased awareness of the disease.
So that's a huge number, right?
That is a huge number.
Obviously.
And it is a fraction of the total MASLD MASH population, but it is still a huge number.
Yes and yes, not necessarily in that order.
Yes.
That presupposes that in 2028, something in the range of 10 to 20 million people will be screened in the U.S. using your 5 to 10% range.
Yes, these are numbers you're using for a total addressable market calculation. We will, of course, be able to service a fraction of that again, right? Because not everybody will make it to the laboratory that has a service.
So how will we know which laboratories have the service? So if I were, say, a knowledgeable patient and I got one of these discordant results, what are the chances that my laboratory would know that this was a service that was available? Or how would I know to find it?
That's a great question, and I think it's very timely that we have this discussion because that's precisely what we're trying to promote, that we have the service available. It is offered out of a central lab. It's a CLIA lab in California. The details are available on our website. We can also contact us to, reach out to us to make the connection, where we would then be able to walk the hepatologist or the gastroenterologist with the procedure of how to order a FibroSIGHT test for their patient. And I can walk through the overview of what is the service exactly. Like one of your questions was, what is the service? So it's essentially deployed as a laboratory developed test. The service starts with the requisition of the FibroSIGHT by a clinician, then the CLIA lab's receipt and scanning of a MASH patient's liver biopsy sample, reading of the sample by a board-certified hepatopathologist, and the issuing of the clinical report with fibrosis assessment to the ordering clinician. So as I mentioned, the service is centrally offered out of one location for now, with sites on expanding. And this is the location where the second harmonic generation scanner has been deployed for clinical use. So the patient sample will need to reach the lab. But the sample logistics, that is getting 1 or 2 unstained FFP sections of the patient's biopsy from a pathology lab where the patient's biopsy are kept, those steps are taken care of by our lab and our client services. So it is rather seamless to order the test. I also just want to mention that the FibroSIGHT services are complemented with routine histology assessment as well. So the H&E and the Mason's trichrome stain are also done. These services are provided at the CLIA lab. So it's really a full service package that we're offering. Much more information is available at the website, and anyone interested can reach out to us through the Contact Us page or even give us a call. We have a phone number on there to reach us.
That's fantastic. Really interesting. Who's the target payer for this?
We're looking at the same payer who, this is basically commercial insurance companies for now, for paying for resmetirom treatment for MASH patients. So we have just commercially launched for FibroSIGHT. So we're putting together the value proposition for payers, which is the managing of their costs for MASH treatments, because we want to, our value proposition is we are identifying the correct patients whenever a biopsy is taken, whenever NITs are non-informative, using the most advanced way to look at a liver biopsy sample. So that is our value proposition to the payers. payers, and that is our target. So there's an overlap between payers who pay for resmetirom and the payers who would consider paying for a liver biopsy assessment like FibroSIGHT.
If F1, F2 is your primary target, as you described it, then the primary question is, should somebody go on a drug or not? Because at F1 they shouldn't, and at F2 they should.
Exactly. It's basically to resolve when the NITs are not able to tell you something, and it could be F2, it could be F3, it could be F1, but the use case would be where it's a confirmed F1, and patient should not be going on resmetirom, or it's a confirmed F2 where they should be going on a resmetirom according to the prescription label at least. So that is how we see it. But the feeding in this testing workflow will happen where NITs are unable to resolve it, because for the most part, for the 95% of the cases, physicians will be making this decision based on NITs as the current practice, so far as the current practice holds.
So what is the perceived value of knowing whether a patient is at F2 or F3, for example?
Well, it's a perceived value to the healthcare system on the whole. Our value proposition is conserving resources, which are already scarce and stretched, on be it for the provider, be it for the payer. So it is really matching the right patient to the right target and reducing futility of treatment, essentially, where the patients could be spared a drug where they don't really need it at that point in time, and making sure that the right patient gets the right treatment at the right time. Today, that is the value, but the value of this technology, there is a lot more in the pipeline that I can talk a bit more about as we go, but this is the first step that HistoIndex has taken for.
And the output of this step will simply be staging?
Output of this step will be a staging that has been aided by the second harmonic generation images by a trained hepatopathologist.
Okay. We'll start with FibroSIGHT. How did the idea for FibroSIGHT emerge from the clinical work and from clinical discussions?
This discordances among pathologists for staging of fibrosis is well known. And in clinical trials where we are also involved, this has been a talking point and has been resolved in different ways by having, a consensus pathology panels and so on. But the fact that second harmonic generation imaging offers such contrast and high resolution that a pathologist becomes more consistent. This was something that was helpful in clinical trials as well. It can be helpful in the recruitment phase.
Massively helpful clinical trials. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this was a natural extension of utility in the clinical practice. So for the longest time, HistoIndex had ambitions in being the leader in fibrosis assessment, not just in MASH, but also in other indications. So that ambition has always existed, and that vision has always existed. With the approval of resmetirom, the impetus to really roll something out for clinical use where clinical decision making could be impacted, that impetus was provided. And so the HistoIndex, basically we're timing it with the clinical climate and taking the next steps accordingly.
That makes tremendous sense. You just said something that caught my ear, which is other conditions. Do any of the cases where it's not clear what the staging is turn out not in fact to be MASH related, or MASLD, I guess would be same kind of thing. But
so FibroSIGHT by itself has been validated for staging of MASH, but as we know, many other fibrotic indications can be visualized on this technology, second harmonic generation. So it's possible, and this is something we're working on as well, for a differential diagnosis of, let's say, autoimmune hepatitis versus NASH. These are other indications that we are hoping to roll out as differential diagnostic testing, but in the narrow scope of what is a clinically validated test, and that's how the healthcare system works, is FibroSIGHT for today is for MASH liver biopsy fibrosis staging. Another product would need to undergo appropriate clinical validation and then be deployed in a lab. But these are all things in the pipeline that we are looking at. So the clinical need must exist, or an unmet need must exist on a large enough scale for HistoIndex to then want to deploy this at a commercial, clinically available level.
To what degree will payer economics at some point in time dictate how this can be and cannot be used?
I think payer economics, at least for FibroSIGHT, will be one of the biggest factors in determining the utility. And we predict payers asking for more definitive evidence of what the fibrosis extent was. In fact, I'm sure you know about certain payers who are already asking for a biopsy-based assessment of MASH before resmetirom can be prescribed and paid for, such as Veterans Affairs, one of them, and I think there are a few commercial insurance payers, particularly out of Florida, who are asking for a biopsy-based assessment before resmetirom treatment. So we see it as a matter of time where more payers are going to be asking for this histological assessment. And so that's where biopsies may be taken more commonly because it's an expensive proposition overall to the healthcare system. And that's when HistoIndex's technology would come in to say, no, this is the most informative way for assessing a biopsy. So use this technology in a cost-effective manner to assess your patient.
So listening through my patient advocate ear, I do hear one challenge, which is that anything that encourages the healthcare system to require biopsy before prescribing will dramatically limit the use of medications because patients just won't do it. Is that a concern here? Is there something HistoIndex can do in terms of how you advocate for the product that to some degree resolves or minimizes that concern?
Other clinical products, they're in the pipeline where beyond just fibrosis staging, there can be many more important management decisions that can be made based on the biopsy, such as what is the risk of progression to a more advanced fibrosis for a given patient. So HistoIndex has done some work previously, and this has been published, where based on certain fibrosis features, even for cases that are equivalently staged as F2, let's say, or by NASH CRN, there is in fact a difference in the rate of progression, which manifests as the change in the outcome for the patient eventually in a matter of time. So one group of patients progresses much faster, one group of patients progresses slower. And this is based on features that can only be detected on the second harmonic generation imaging and quantified. So with this kind of information, what we would advocate is that the physician is really going to be empowered with a lot more knowledge on how to manage this patient far beyond just fibrosis staging. And ultimately what we're looking at is predicting drug responses, especially when multiple drugs come to market based on the patient's baseline fibrosis condition, fibrosis features. So we are advocating that biopsies can tell you a lot more and will remain relevant, especially as more and more therapies become widely available and as more and more patients come to see the physician for their particular condition. So risk stratification of patients will become very important, and that's where the biopsy will be the most informative of all pieces of information.
Yeah, again, that makes perfect sense. It does, however, raise the same question I asked, which is that if we require biopsy as part of what we're going to do for patients to come into getting treatment, I suspect that will reduce the number of patients getting treatment.
Well, I think it's a conversation between the physician and the patient to be had to convince the patient of the value, right? If the physician sees the value and in the long-term healthcare benefits.
Look, it's a fantastic and exciting product, okay? So I don't mean to say that it's not, but I can hear where that one's going to come from. In fact, I've got in my ear people, well, not literally in my ear, you're the only person I'm talking to, but in the back of my head, I've got the voices in the non-psychiatric sense saying, well, gee, biopsy limits patient desire to be treated. So I'm wondering over time if any of this will be more generalizable. Can we take lessons out of this that you don't need a biopsy to do? Or will you have the ability to correlate certain kinds of results, certain kinds of NIT results, and say, if this NIT pattern is consistent, then that would correlate with what we've learned in FibroSIGHT to suggest X. And only if you have inconsistencies do you need to go on a biopsy or something like that.
Yeah, well, definitely for the NIT's development or the more consistent NITs or accurate NIT development, we do think basing it off of something like second harmonic generation imaging would be a lot more consistent, would lead to more reproducible results from NITs or reliable results from NITs themselves. But whether based on a certain NIT outcome, I think it ties back to the question of where NITs are not giving you the right answer or an easy answer, we recommend a biopsy being taken. So I believe there's still room for biopsies in this.
In the case you're talking about, absolutely. If I were a practicing hepatologist right now, is there a way for me to know which cases are inconclusive? It's simple enough.
Based on NITs?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is. The guidelines have certain recommendations and certain cutoffs. So when the same patient falls on the opposite sides of these cutoffs, it's basically a non-informative outcome. And perhaps there's no other NITs available to resolve this because not all NITs like MRE is not available at all facilities. So it may be the case that this physician decides that to conclusively make sure that does this patient have advanced fibrosis, then do a biopsy.
Well, yeah, and that's another interesting point, right, which is if MRE were accessible, you're right, depending on what's available to the physician, the choices might vary. Listen, I think it's an amazingly exciting product. And I'm, as you know, I'm a big believer in what HistoIndex can do and what one can learn from SHG. So certainly it will enlighten care over time.
We believe so, yes.
Yeah. Now the challenge is going to be to make sure that it does so in such a way that doesn't hinder the number of patients getting the care. But, we've got years to figure that out. First, you got to get it out there, and then you figure out what to do with it. And this is the get it out there phase.
Precisely. This is the first step.
So now that I've asked you what might go wrong in 5 years, last question. Are there other practitioners for whom you think this will be particularly helpful?
You mean particular practices or?
Yeah, or practice situations, geography, availability of certain kinds of resources, anything like that.
Well, I think there's another situation where biopsies and assessment of biopsies and what's happening on the patient's condition is post-treatment, which really after resmetirom's approval just 1 year ago, it's kind of early to say, but there could be a situation where NITs again are not able to conclusively tell what is the conclusive status of the patient on the response to treatment or non-response to treatment. So a biopsy might be taken there. In the near future, this is what we're thinking will be another scenario. But that percentage of patients, I think it's a little more to be seen what percentage will be assessed in this way. But yeah, that's what we think in the near future will be another use.
So, Yukti, let me suggest that the complexity with answering some of these questions to some degree speaks to how novel this technology is. It's very easy for people to figure out what to do with something that looks like everything they already have. But here we're talking about something that looks vastly different from what people currently have in practice. So I think it becomes harder to figure those kinds of things out. But I also think that's what makes the challenge a lot more exciting.
Absolutely right.
Those are the fun questions. Not always the fun answers, always the fun questions. Anything else you'd like to share with this audience today about FibroSIGHT or the direction which HistoIndex is heading?
Yeah, the company is at an exciting stage of growth. We've been in the clinical trial space for a long time. We continue to be in that space, but we are paving the path for application of this technology in clinical care. So, like I said, it's the first step in this journey, and being on podcasts like yours are able to promote this message that there is such a technology. It is available clinically, and so we will see more and more applications of this coming up in the next 1, 2, 3 years. And a lot more information, as I said, can be found on our website. And please also just follow us on LinkedIn to keep up with the latest updates related to this technology and its applications.
So congratulations to you and to Gideon and Dean and the entire team and everyone who's been involved in this. It's a fantastic, exciting, bold, visionary idea. Some of the details remain to be worked out, but, and as you say, more product to come along. But it's an exciting time for the entire profession, and this is a really unique angle on what makes it so exciting.
Yeah, and we forge ahead together.
Yeah, all of us. Very cool stuff. Thanks for your time today, and we'll be back with our expert interview with Jeff McIntyre in just a minute.
Finally, this week's expert is Jeff McIntyre, Vice President, Liver Programs at the Global Liver Institute. Jeff joins Roger to discuss the impact of job cuts at FDA and NIH, what we know and can infer about further changes ahead, and how patients can advocate for themselves and each other in these challenging times.
So because timing is everything, our expert this week is Jeff McIntyre, our good friend from Global Liver Institute. Jeff and I, in fact, we're chatting for a few minutes before we turn this on about all the reasons that having Jeff on today is an excellent idea, and none of them have to do with the fact that it's April Fool's Day per se. Jeff, do you have an April Fool's prank in your life today?
Oh, I think I could point to many things that I wish I could, credit as being for April Fools, but I think I'm the April Fool. I think that's what it is in my life. I'm the April Fool.
But that could be any of us. We all could read the front page of the papers today, particularly if you're in healthcare, and say, oh God, that's the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life, except then you realize it's not funny. It's just exactly what's happening. So we're going to do two things in this conversation. Number one is we're going to talk about April Fool's Day, or if you will, April 1st, and everything that we've seen in the last couple of days around policy and Washington and preliminary think about what might it mean for fatty liver disease, celiac liver disease, what might it mean for the drugs in development, what might it mean for patients, what might it mean for all of that. And then second, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the subject that was covered in the interview that folks heard right before this with Yukti Chowdhury from HistoIndex talking about FibroSIGHT, which is, I think, really an interesting product in several different ways. Some good, some just interesting, but all that. So why don't we start with April 1st? Let's recap what all has happened today. I'm going to ask you to recap it, what's happened in Washington today, because you're closer to it than I have, and I haven't looked in the newspaper for 5 hours.
Well, it's a continuation of what's been happening ever since the new administration came in. I mean, President Trump came in with promises of drastically reshaping the government and is well on his path to do that. I mean, it started with a flurry of executive actions his very first day in office, and then we've seen it spread out. It feels like on the given week is when the emphasis is going to be. I've got friends in the FAR service. They went through their layoffs. I've seen friends in the agriculture had the same thing there. And now we're seeing this week much more concentrated stuff around HHS. Specifically, I've seen announcements around FDA and HRSA. And so it's concerning. I think there's a real concern that in this chopping down of the government tree, if you will, about kind of what happens. The immediacy is what is the impact on those most affected, the government workers, the people that are local, they're trying to sustain their families. I think there's an immediate impact. It's certainly felt here in the Washington region. But then there's also the impact of what happens when you don't have that sort of career wisdom or career experience in place to help guide the day-to-day conversations and the directions on this. Some even point to the text messaging episode with Hegseth and some of the others around Yemen that had career employees been in place, they would have never been on those phones to begin with. That's a sort of basic thing of use this phone, not that phone. And so if we blow that up to a larger scale for our conversation, I think we've got a real question about what happens with drug approval process. I think we have a real question of what happens with clinical trial oversight. I think we have a real question about drug safety in the procedures. I think anything and everything that the FDA has done in the past is suddenly going to have a question mark behind it that we're just not going to know until we know. And even when we know, it may be a very different color than what it's been in the past. And in our previous conversation, you mentioned Rob Califf's statement about what we used to know of the FDA is no more. And I think that's a fair statement. That is what the promise that was made, is that government agencies would no longer be what they used to be. And we've seen that with USAID completely getting obliterated, and now Department of Education is on its way out. Those have been a lot of the headlines in the healthcare field. I think we're really going to see that there's an immediate impact, but I think we're going to be seeing the consequences of it much, much longer down the road. We haven't had the impact in infectious disease. We haven't had a SARS. We haven't had a COVID, and the inability to respond to that, because of the decisions made. So this is just the immediate stuff. And I think getting further out is really going to take some prognostication to kind of see what the implications are. And unfortunately, most of it's pretty pessimistic, I think, right now.
So when last we had this conversation on this podcast, it was November, and you said, well, we don't know. I think now we know what's been said. We don't know what will be done. Now we know what's been done or what's being done.
What we are seeing is the first quarter of what's being done. Thinking of it as an American football game, we see the first quarters. They're still setting the field for what's going to be done. And I truly believe that we just haven't seen the consequences. You get rid of the Department of Education. Well, what happens to Head Start? Well, that goes away. Then what's the consequence of not having Head Start in the world? What's the consequence of not having people in place to run a quicker drug approval program at the FDA? Well, we haven't got to that place of consequence yet. We just see all the mechanisms being put in place for it.
Oh, but we will. Are those the mechanisms that are being in place, or are those the mechanisms that are being casually destroyed? I mean, you think about that Elon story, right? About he realized that someone did away with, I forget which disease it was, but he did away with everything in the government that was fighting the disease. So he simply erased what he did away with and undid it and invited people back to work. There's a real casualness about this. It's like these guys don't understand what they're playing with.
Well, I think that was Ebola that they were speaking about, that they gotten rid of everybody on that and then they tried to rehire them. But that's been the case in several aspects where they've gone in, there's an infamous moment very much memed of him coming up on stage at the Conservative Political Action Committee at CPAC with a chainsaw.
Right.
And that's apropos, man. He's just running through the crowd with a chainsaw right now and then figuring they'll hire people back. And this is unfortunately not new. He did the same thing at Twitter.
Right.
When he bought it and has now since sold it again. But that it's just you get everybody out and then you hand select the people that are coming in. And I think one of the things that is not spoken about in this is optimistically, and we those of us that like to be optimistic and have some hope in our lives, there will come a better day where we will have an administration that is more prioritized towards health, more prioritized towards prevention, the things that the values that we hold to help patients especially. And that's going to be a big battle that we're set up for now, is trying to reinstate or trying to address some of these programs, because all of them are going to go back to, is it worth the money? And so we're going to be fighting these battles on two fronts, one right now, one in the future as well.
So if you happen to live in a disease category like, say, fatty liver, MASLD, MASH, where the scientific dam has broken and mechanisms of action are coming to fore that actually appear to work and help, and you're in various stages of clinical trials, what's the best you can hope for, say, if you're a patient?
That's a great question, Roger. Well, the mechanism is broken with the approval of resmetirom. We see that's out there, and we're fortunate that it broke through when it did, because it has now allowed us being the patient community and those aligned with us, to identify and kind of run the traps on the rest of the pathway. And we've seen that there are traps and things in the rest of the pathway there, because we've got issues with reimbursement, we've got issues with payers, we've seen especially issues at the Veterans Administration. Those are the things that are good for us to be able to engage, and we will continue to engage and fight those battles. To my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we've got two other potential therapies that are queued up that should go through the approval process sometime in the next year or two. Timeline kind of is open to that. I think the question for that is, will that timeline still hold? We've seen even at the CDC that there was a coding meeting for the ICD-10 coding that was supposed to happen in March. My understanding is they just didn't have the personnel. They let everything go. People were confused. That hearing was it was postponed, then it was postponed, and then it was canceled, and now we're doing everything in an October meeting. So we'll be doing twice as much of that October meeting.
Yeah, 6 months later, right.
Yeah, and so there's a delay there in terms of being able to get the appropriate coding for things like fibrosis, which GLI has put in for. And so I think that's going to be analogous to everywhere else. Will drug approvals go through at the same rate? Nobody knows. Will accelerated approval still be a thing? Nobody knows. I think there was a little bit of a question mark around that already. And now with this administration coming in with so many shenanigans, it's just kind of hard to tell where it is. I think if there is hope to point towards, some high potential in this, is that while we've had mechanisms that have gotten through, there's also been a real rise and a real great conversation and push around, especially for fatty liver, around the GLP-1s. And so I think that there is a potential for, even though if they're not specifically geared towards treatment of liver, there are still the possibility it could be perhaps written off script, or there are treatment options, because so many, as we know, fatty liver patients present with co-occurring conditions, that there are still some pathways available there. They may not be the ways that we have hoped we could rely on the government for. And so that raises the importance of patient advocacy and groups like GLI and Liver Education Advocates and the other patient advocacy groups, is to make sure that patients are aware of their options, that they're empowered, that they understand the payer sort of environment, and can make the right connections to make sure that their pathways are clear for their best treatment.
So listening to you, one of the things that strikes me is it's not clear whether we need to work around the government or against the government.
I don't think those are mutually exclusive right now.
I think that's fair.
I think that we have to find the opportunities to work with the government. We know as a patient organization, for instance, that, if you fire all the scientists, for instance, that are working in an area and you move clinical trials somewhere else, that's what you're doing. You're just moving it else. And so where do you want it to be? Do you want the scientists and the research to be in the US, or do you want it to be in China? Do you want it to be Southeast Asia? Do you want to be in Latin America? There are other places. I've seen stuff come through about, where they're looking to hire scientists fired in this way. And so it's going to continue to a certain extent. It's just not the most efficient and not ideal, and it's overly politicized right now as well. And so I think what it presents to us is we have to find these places where we can present our argument. This is the constituency that this administration promised to help. I think there are still bridges to be built there, but in the meantime, if they're not going to do the job, then patient advocacy groups are going to stand up and be there for their patients.
How much does MAHA concern you in all this? MAHA, for those who don't know, being Bobby's initiative to make America healthy again, which is basically all the fraudulent stuff.
Yeah, it's a hell of a bumper sticker, isn't it? Really, I'll give them credit on the politics of it, is they really captured a turn of the phrase there on that. The thing about MAHA that is so frustrating is that there are certain aspects of legitimacy in the idea. We'd like America to be healthy. We'd love to do more prevention. It's kind of like saying to be against that's like, being for child abuse or domestic violence. It's just like, who's going to argue with making America healthy again? Even more so than making America great again. That's even more innocuous than that. But I think when you get into the details, it's really, really concerning. I don't know that you do that by firing 40% of HRSA or by letting most of the FDA go and the career expertise with that. And we have seen when it comes especially to the food and nutrition part of that, which I tend to be particularly cued in on, is that what they have started off with their MAHA commission is they've identified and are working on infant formula. And so who's going to argue about making infant formula more healthy, about taking artificial and processed stuff out of infant formula, although infant formula by its very nature is a processed food. And so you can't say that you're going to make this processed food better while also getting rid of processed foods, but it will also set a precedent for how they adapt and deal with other things, I think. And so there's a high level of suspicion around everything, but the other thing that this administration, at least in its previous term, was known for was a whole lot of hype and not a lot of follow through. And I think it's fair to say that, they've often called this a shock and awe sort of process. And the issue with shock and awe, if you remember from the Iraq invasion and, when it was first quoted, wasn't the shock and awe. It was the inability to follow through and to make anything happen afterward, to be able to provide sustainability, to provide, a common, interest of a platform, to be able to provide democracy. And that's where the concern is in this, is they're going to shock and awe the hell out of the U.S. government, but do they have the expertise and the wisdom to be able to help us once they've clear-cut their way through this forest?
I think that's well put and an excellent perspective. But it scares me a little bit more in MAHA because a lot of the people that Bobby is surrounding himself with are people whose definition of making America healthy really don't have a lot to do with making America healthy.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, Roger. I think, they certainly don't have an evidence base. In some instances, we've seen some of the members that have essentially been influential podcasters or people with nutrition startups, that they'll have a grain of truth that they can step on, a grain of evidence. But then when taken to the breadth of the issue that they have to deal with, it really collapses on its own weight.
Yeah, and then, as you say, politically, it's really attractive.
Yeah, absolutely. Who doesn't want to make America healthy again?
And by the way, just a note, somebody has come on this podcast frequently in the past and railed against the food industrial complex.
I can't imagine. Who would have thought that, we've got this new administration that's essentially quoting many of the same sort of slogans and bumper stickers that we saw in the Let's Move, movement from the Obama administration. The thing that's interesting about that, though, is that there is a legitimate argument. I don't necessarily agree with it 100%, but there's a legitimate argument that Let's Move was not as successful as it could have been, that it was a lot of PSAs and whatnot. And so that's kind of where the expectation is around MAHA, except MAHA is also combined with this just clear cutting of jobs and programs and services, which really runs in the face of this. We've never done prevention well in the U.S. We've done public health prevention well with seatbelts and cigarette smoking, and some would say parts of the COVID response. But cigarettes and seatbelts were either due to legislation or due to lawsuits. And if that's what it takes, this administration is not going to be the one that does that.
So let's put the most optimistic spin we can on what we're talking about right now. What would that look like? Or is that merely the least pessimistic spin, first of all? Is there a legitimately optimistic spin to put on all this right now, the way it looks?
I think so. Have hope in your providers. Have good conversations with them. Reach out to the patient advocate groups. Empower yourself. I've always been a little bit of a DIY person myself anyway. And so this is the opportunity. If you weren't motivated to take better care of your health and be on top of this, there are organizations like the Global Liver Institute that are out there ready to help inform and support and fight these battles. And we have partnerships with groups that we can set you up with. We have an entire liver action network that is spread throughout the U.S. and is beginning to grow globally as well, to be able to help answer the questions you've got. If you put all of your faith into one thing and see that one thing collapse, whether it's the government or a pill or whatever it is, then the optimism comes in seeing that there are others around you going through the same thing and that there are more resources available to be able to help you be able to address this.
Excellent point. Along with which I will go back to one of the most important, although not necessarily the way people had in mind, statements ever made on this podcast was the question Mike Charlton asked 4 years ago about who's going to be the Larry Kramer of NASH. Do we need that now?
I don't think so. I mean, I gotta say, the environment in which Larry Kramer came about, and I don't want to say prospered, but in which he energized the base that he was working with and made the changes happen, is just such a radically different thing today. If Larry Kramer existed in the land of Twitter and Facebook and misinformation, I think it's a very different thing that he has as he goes forward. He was the right person at the right time to do the right thing when he did his piece. Today, as politics is set up, as society is set up, as the world is set up, we have to be more collaborative. We have to be, working together to make the right things happen. And so, the FDA gets into all sorts of goofiness with this clear cutting of jobs. And so now we take a look at the EMA. Maybe that it steps up in Europe, that we can begin to emphasize that. Maybe we build bridges with other patient organizations, with other more industry patient organizations sort of partnerships. I think that it's never bad to have an outspoken voice out there demanding change, but this is an era where we have to stick together and have to be collaborative as opposed to having just that one dynamo out there as the tip of the spear.
Okay. With that noted, where outside of the patient advocate community should patients or providers be looking right now for kindred spirits and mutual support?
From a patient perspective, that goes to your community. Whatever gives you comfort, that's the right choice. To me, whatever makes you comfortable, that's the right choice. Certainly, there are some bad choices in what makes people comfortable, but in the immediacy, that's it. GLI set up with a ton of resources. I think having a strong connection with your provider and being able to talk with them. My experience, and I don't mean to be a homer for this, but my experience with many of the pharmaceutical companies that are looking at these products, they have been a good place for information on stuff, and they have even been willing to help individuals with things such as, obtaining the prescription that they need, working against stuff. We found that especially in the case of the Veterans Administration. And so I don't think you want to limit yourself necessarily. If your spirit is troubled and church is a place that you can go to get a peace of mind, to be able to take a breath in order to be able to then readdress the next day's challenges, then by all means, church, mosque, temple, whatever it is, if it's time with your dog, if it's, the support groups that we have and that other groups have as well, it's mostly important that folks know they're not alone in this. And we had a real issue with this with NASH back in the day as it was. We have patients that show up at our Advanced Advocacy Academy every year and say that they've never met anyone else with fatty liver disease, but prevalence figures of that are going towards 1 in 3 right now. And so I think don't be alone.
Good. I think that's a great guidance on which to end. And the one thought I have going way back is, 40 years ago, before HIV, everything got approved in Europe first because the FDA was entirely organized around not producing thalidomide. So everything went to Europe first. And then there was a period in the late 80s, early 90s where that just turned around. And we've been living in the turned around world ever since. So we don't know what this will be, I guess.
Well, and I would say, too, that Mexico just announced a streamlining and a clearer pathway for their clinical trials as well. And so we may see, since, as you said, the 80s and 90s, we traditionally saw it go FDA, EMA, and then into other countries. But I think we may begin to see some rearrangement of that, and we're set up to support that.
Okay. Excellent. So with that, let's shift gears a little bit. Okay, let's go to our other topic, which is FibroSIGHT. I have some common understanding of what it does, and I think Yukti did a very nice job of describing that in her interview earlier today.
Yeah, thank you. Well, HistoIndex came out with a big announcement on approval for FibroSIGHT. It's I guess you've talked about this earlier in the episode as well, but it's, this technology that is a non-staining stain, if you will. It uses lasers to be able to promote and identify where fibrosis is. Their website's got a couple of really cool graphics on it for folks to check out if they're interested in that. What's interesting about this is that we have a technological advance that I think will be helpful for patients, but it is from biopsy-derived samples. And so, as we said earlier in our conversation, Roger, this is exactly where we should be and where we should not be at the same time. There's a real catch-22 with this. When you consider biopsy, yeah, it's awesome. We should be in a place where we can promote and support innovation in the field for those that have had a biopsy. And better information, better data. We've seen a lot of improvements over AI, for instance, in identifying some of this stuff as well. Totally promote it. It's going to be be helpful for a certain population. But I think the reality behind this is it still doesn't address the basic issue around biopsy and diagnosis, frankly, as well, which goes to biopsy being still the standard. And that's a problem. If we had a more neutral sort of endpoints as the standard for diagnosis, if you will, for drug approval, specifically with the FDA, then you would see a lot more non-invasives come in to be able to meet those endpoints and not be relying on biopsy so much. We'll never be completely rid of biopsy. There's still going to be a certain small need for that. But I think the issue with the FibroSIGHT, as great as it is and as innovative as it is, frankly, is it's not going to scale. It is limited by biopsy itself, which has limitations built into it as well.
So define the nature of the limitations of biopsy as you see them.
Well, not to be glib, but they suck.
Don't sugarcoat it, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, who signs up for a biopsy for a weekend, escape? The biopsies are not fun. They've gotten a lot better, but at the end of the day, biopsies are painful. You run a risk of infection. There's bleeding involved. It's something that patients only want to do as a last resort towards diagnosis or treatment. And so the notion that people would have to do it repeatedly in a clinical trial or as a reliable method, say, of management or screening, is just not effective. Patients are always going to be resistant to it. It is a procedure, and as such, it can't be done as efficiently as some of the non-invasives are done. So you've got the patient identification and the patient risk. They don't want to because it sucks. It's painful, bleed out, infection, all the things there. But then you've also got this pragmatic side to it as well, is that if we can use some of the non-invasive technologies that I've seen that are beginning to emerge, those are things that might be able to be more easily scaled to populations that are going to be more in need of it. So we're serving more patients that way, but it's also a business model that allows us to be able to have a larger audience for services that are going to be able to be diagnosed, but also be able to be served and have their liver disease addressed.
That sounds right. I mean, kind of my reaction talking to Yukti earlier today was I think not so different from that. It's a good thing to have, and they intend to bring out more product behind it to do some really exciting things, like tell you which drug is likely to work in which patient. But the problem is that if you limit it to biopsy, then you're going to really reduce the scale of patient population you can treat in a world where 1 out of every 3 people has MASLD and maybe 15% of them. If you're assessing for F1 versus F2, which is the example that Yukti gave this morning, that's a lot of people. And I understand why it's attractive. It's attractive to payers because F1s should not be on Rezdiffra and F2s should be on Rezdiffra.
There is no bright red line, their imagery aside. There's no bright red line that distinguishes F2 from F3 or F1 from F2 necessarily. You want to treat F2 and definitely are treating F3. And this sort of technology could conceivably help you do that. But again, it's a limited population. It especially makes me nervous to hear about it. It could help with drug efficacy, because it's not, then what they're saying is it's not the technology that will help with it, but it's that repeated biopsies will help with drug efficacy, and that's just not going to be the case.
I don't think that's their point. Okay, I think frankly their point is if you take a look at some stuff we talked about last year after seeing their stuff, if you can map where in the liver fibrosis is worst, then you can figure out which drugs attack which zones of the liver more effectively. And now you're not in repeated biopsy, you're in trying to get it right. You're trying to get the first decision right fast.
That's a fair statement, and I'll give them credit for that. No question about that. I think I'm still conservative enough to think that there's still going to be biopsy in that patient's future, based on this. Because even if they've identified, one of the things that we know about biopsy is the issue with sample error. You just may not get the right sample out of it. And if they are lucky enough to do it, then I think there's going to be a need for confirmation of that as well, which would only be done by biopsy.
That makes sense. What all this is about, I think, at the end of the day, is it winds up being a rate-limiting technology in terms of how many patients can get treated, but it means that the ones who get treated probably get treated better.
Absolutely. I think that's a great read on it as well. Absolutely necessary, probably not sufficient, but the people that have qualified for it, that have the biopsy, I love that the technology is still evolving. I think we have a lot of excitement around this sort of laser technology, which HistoIndex uses. I think if you kind of layer on the stuff going on with AI that we're seeing with large larger samples. I mean, it's a really exciting area seeing what can be done with that. But the issue for fatty liver patients specifically starts way before that. It starts with screening and management of their disease, and I just don't see this as being as relevant to the larger populations, again, that can be then scaled and used, hopefully even in other countries as well.
Okay, makes sense. What else should we talk about briefly before we go? As we noted before we got on the line, I refuse to talk about English football. In the absence of Jimmy Johnson and Jeff Jordan, it's going to be hard to get people who aren't native NASCAR followers to understand what's going on in NASCAR. So I think we're dead on sports. Anything else of interest?
Yeah. I guess so. I think by the time you take Tottenham and Hendrick Motorsports away, then we're at loss of male conversation, aren't we?
No, we've always got restaurants, but we're not going to do that on this, right? Okay.
Well, we do have. I think one of the other things I would highlight here, Roger, is we have some exciting stuff going on globally on this, which is that I've been spending a lot of time and working on getting SLD, getting MASLD and MASH, or steatototic liver disease, recognized as a NCD by the WHO as part of the NCD agenda for 2030, I think it is. And so we have a side event coming up. We had a successful side event last year in Geneva with the WHO. We have another one planned this year as part of the WHO, which will be a week after AASLD. And we're feeling good about stuff. I mean, this is a great example of, when you talk about the Trump administration going through everything with a chainsaw right now, they have withdrawn from the World Health Organization completely. And there's a lot of concern. I think there's a lot of legitimate danger in that. But in the meantime, groups like GLI are stepping up to try to ensure that patient needs are being addressed. And so we have a campaign and things that we're working on in partnership with other medical societies and other patient groups to really push SLD to get recognized as a non-communicable disease as part of the NCD agenda at the WHO and then eventually at the UN as well.
Okay, and that's exciting and important, and we'll be tracking all that as the year goes along. Thank you, my friend. Looking forward to being in touch soon. I'd love to have you back on at some point at the end of May, early June to talk about after AASLD in Geneva, what we got and how all that's worked out.
And here's Roger with the Episode 3 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. Here's hoping that President Trump's comments about Zelensky signal a more even-handed policy from the U.S. than what we had feared. That's it for me this week on that subject.
Thanks again, listeners.
We have more feedback. Listeners are starting to find us and grab their surfboards, and also that you like our new format. We don't have 7-day audited number for episode 2, but the 5-day Buzzsprout number is slightly higher than the number had been for week 1. We do know that we're getting more hits on YouTube than for the first episode, and in a couple of other places. So keep listening. Please tell friends and colleagues that we're back with a new format that provides more information and covers more topics every week. In addition, I've received more feedback personally about our return and the new design, all positive. In particular, I want to thank a listener who wrote, and I quote, "I come to our clinic every day and share my newly acquired knowledge to my team. Thanks for all you do, for all your guests' input. It's making waves of changes in my work." Please share any feedback or suggestions you have, including guests we might feature as experts or newsmakers. We know what we're building, or perhaps rebuilding here, and your opinions are invaluable to us.
In April, Surfing MASH will have some special events.
Our April Roundtable series will drop beginning with our April 17th episode, which is episode 5. The theme for the month will be drug development in the past year. Our focus will be on everything trials have shown us in the past year about proper use of resmetirom, expectations for medicines that have reported phase 2 or phase 3 results, and promising modes of action earlier in development. On April 24th, we will post a special episode marking the first anniversary of the passing of our co-founder, Stephen Harrison, one day earlier. Instead of the typical newsmakers and expert segments, we will have one segment looking specifically at the ways that Stephen shaped drug development that will live on in research and theory long beyond him, and another on how his company, Summit Clinical Research and Pinnacle Clinical Research, have moved forward in his absence and also in his spirit. These should be powerful and fascinating. Can't wait to hear your responses.
Where would you like to see Roger? Part 2.
For the rest of this year, the major suggestions I've received are the most obvious ones: AASLD, AASLD, Paris MASH, Liver Forum. Also, a couple of mentions of ADA and AHA. I'm working on what a budget would look like to get to all of these. If anyone would like to sponsor my attendance at these or other specific events, please reach out. And also, please share anywhere else you believe I should go.
And that wraps up Season 6, Episode 3 of Surfing the MASH Tsunami. On behalf of the surfers, our guests, and our sponsors, Madrigal Pharmaceuticals, Liver Right, and Tawa Zen Health, thanks for joining us this week.
Please join us again next week when we conclude our roundtable on the Emerging Trends Conference, while our newsmakers and expert explore current issues and major ideas.
And until next week, stay safe, Surf on, and we'll see you on podcast. Bye-bye now.